So if anybody wants to know the definition of a hand up, Ann Austin is the definition of a hand up. She and I met about 5 or 6 years ago at a International Leadership Association conference, and we've been friends ever since. And she saw what I don't always see in myself, and she's given me an opportunity to come share with you all. And I really appreciate the opportunity. I'm humbled. She's given you a kind of a very good picture of why I was inspired to be a Marine. She's told you about my father. My father was an infantry officer. He fought in Korea and Vietnam. And he was the exact example of what I thought ethical leadership was. And my mom loved the Marine Corps. She was a cheerleader through and through. She knew everybody that my dad knew. She knew all the ins and outs. She lived in Quantico, Virginia, which is the home of the Marine Corps. It's the crossroads of the Marine Corps. That's where she lived. If you know the town, it's actually a military base. But it actually has a civilian town attached to it. And my mom actually lived in Quantico town. And very few people can say that. So she met my dad, kind of like an officer and a gentleman. She met my dad when she was working for the Red Cross in the library in the town. And he was a second lieutenant. He was a basketball player for Navy. And back in the day, military sports teams were very important. And the generals of the Marine Corps were very happy that he chose Marine Corps over Navy because he played on the all-Marine basketball team until he was called up for Korea. So then he had to go. He left the team and started his career in earnest. So that's my inspiration. Not everybody has that inspiration, but there was a while when I retired from the Marine Corps, there was a while that I thought, wouldn't it be funny if all women that succeeded in the Marine Corps had a male role model like my dad? So I had made friends with one of the generals we're going to talk about today. Her name is Tracy Garrett. Tracy Garrett retired a few years ago as a 2-star. Tracy called me up. Then she was General Garrett. I was Colonel Waldrop. Then she called me up. She was in San Diego, and she said, hey, what are you getting ready to do? I said, I'm getting ready to retire. She said, what are you going to do? Let's go have a drink. So we met and had a drink, and I found out that her father was a lieutenant colonel. And I sat there while we were having drinks and happy hour, and I said, wouldn't it be funny if all the women generals had an inspiration that was a father that was a Marine? And she goes, I think that's your study. So subsequent, she was my gatekeeper for my study. So I'm going to go in and out of the practical reason why I wanted to study women generals and back to the methodology and the findings of the study. So she provided me gatekeeper services, which meant that she wasn't going to give me access independently to each of these women generals, but she was going to provide me a segue and an introduction so that I could.
I'm sorry, our photographer says you have to be on the stage.
Oh. Okay, I'll be up on the stage. Very uncomfortable and awkward situation for me, but.
Sorry.
Okay, is that better? Okay, so this is not where I thrive. I am a practitioner of leadership. So this is an example of how that shows up. I like to be amongst my peeps. I like to be hands-on with people. I don't like to stand up. I don't like to be the grandiose presenter. So I will continue. So anyway, General Garrett was my gatekeeper, and she allowed me access to all the women generals. So let's talk about how did I approach this study, and we'll talk about the women generals here in a minute. So it's really important. So my thesis advisor, my dissertation advisor, my committee said you kind of have to have a framework, theoretical framework. Well, I struggle with theory. I couldn't get my hands around it. So what we ended up doing was studying culture, structure, and agency around how these women became general. So my research question was, how do these women describe their path to success? I wanted to know from their voice, from their experience, and I did not overlay any theoretical structure on top of their experience. I let them tell me. What I was hoping to do was to find a recipe for how these women succeeded. Bottom line up front, bluff is what we call it in the military. Bottom line up front, there is no magic path. There is no recipe. These women couldn't have been more different. And I struggled to find any commonality amongst these women. So, what I want to point out here is everybody, and there's a lot of conversation about agency. Agency is, hey, great to see you again. How do these women operate? How do they behave? Their behaviors, their attitudes. Well, in this population, and I'm proud to say my study was a population of 10 at the time of my research. Now it is 11, effective July 2017. I had to add her picture in there today. It was an honor to do that. I'm still waiting to hear some specifics back from her. She's not in my study because she was beyond my study. But there were 10 women in my population, and I was able to interview 8 of the 10 in person, 1 deceased in 2013, and I understand that the previous 7 years of her, the last 7 years of her life would have been complicated by dementia, so I wouldn't have been able to get in there anyway. And I had 1 refrain from participation. So I had 8 of my 10 population. And when I talk about, so the agency is what they do, but my dissertation advisor really pointed out that structure and culture make a difference in these women's path, in their trajectory. So I bring this out to point that in 40s and 50s, the poster on the left-hand side was traditional. And it was part structure and part culture. Structure was we were freeing men to fight. We were freeing men to go overseas so that we could backfill them and get the best and most legal manpower to go fight wars. They were proud. They were proud to serve. They were begging to come in. And in the history of the Marine Corps, I think some of my scholars will support me on this, women have always had to have higher qualifications than men. At least in the Marine Corps they did. So women had to have higher GCT scores, higher ASVAB scores, whatever scores existed at the time that they were enlisting. Women Marines had to have more. And I think they had to have signatures to enlist that their male counterparts at the same age didn't. So anyway, so the culture is changing and the structure has changed as well. This poster on the right indicates that although structure changes and opportunities increase, culture is slow to change. This poster on the right was probably mid to late 1990s and still recruiting men when women were, the opportunities had increased and women were more prevalent. So it's interesting that I point this out, that although structure and opportunities and laws change, culture is slow to change, especially in the Marine Corps, when even today, women are just shy of 8% population in the Marine Corps. For those of you, so really how I intended to come up with this talk was I really am interested in a couple of inspirational thoughts that you had coming into this topic. So by a show of, anybody want to say why they wanted to come into this talk? What was their inspiration? I know somebody in the Marine Corps. I didn't know there were women generals. Yes. Thank you. What service were you? Oh, perfect. Thank you. Thanks for coming. Anybody else? Yes, ma'am. Yes. Yes. So the first chapter of my dissertation, thank you. The first chapter of my dissertation said, I'm getting very tired of hearing the victim and women are not making it story. And I am the one that takes the cup half full. I have the shirt from Life is Good that says half full, and it's a wine glass. I don't care whether it's water in there, but it's half full. So the issue is that for that very reason, when I left the Marine Corps and went into the civilian institution at University of San Diego, which happens to be a Catholic school, all my peers who had very little experience in the military said, wow, how many times were you sexually assaulted? Well, I'll tell you, that was not my experience. It may be many, but that is not my experience. And I think that voice gets heard louder than those that have been able to navigate that unscathed. So I'm not here to diminish other people's experience, but I'm telling you it's not everybody's. And when people say women aren't making it, to know that there are 10 women, now 11, in the Marine Corps that have made the rank of general, and nobody knows about it, breaks my heart. So I said, if I need to be that voice, I am prouder than a peacock to be able to bring that voice to people. Yes, sir. The defense has technically 5 services: Coast Guard, Air Force, Navy, Army, Marine. Marine is the smallest. Our core competency over all the services is combat. That's all we do. We are always the smallest. We are called the 911 force for a reason. We are usually the first ones in if it's not the Navy SEALs and if it's not the Army, Delta Force. So we are the 911 force. Everything we do is to close with and destroy the enemy. That's not a real inviting environment for women. I mean, to ask for 50% women in the Marine Corps. So on another topic, let's also consider there's a difference between equity and equality. We want equity, but we don't need equality in some of these very, very specialized organizations. So it doesn't break my heart to say that the Marine Corps is only 8%. I almost straddle the line to say if we get too big of a percentage of women, maybe we're not as effective because our job is combat, to close with and kill the enemy, usually up front, seeing the whites of somebody's eyes. So I actually haven't figured out the percentage of these 10 women relative, but laws and structure also make a difference. So the laws, women weren't allowed to become generals in the military until 1967, 2 years after I was born. My dissertation covers the important history to try to frame why women are so slow in becoming generals. The first woman wasn't promoted. She was an Army nurse in 1970. There were 2 Army women generals promoted the same day in 1970. In Marine Corps form, knuckle dragging, Marine Corps could not have dragged their heels anymore. And finally in 1978, we promoted our first woman general. It was then Colonel Margaret Brewer, and she was appointed. She was not selected competitively amongst her peers. President Carter went to our commandant and said, okay, Marine Corps, you're the last holdout. You need to get a woman general. And they went and they said, who's the most senior and who's been around the longest? And they picked Margaret Brewer. Now I'm telling you, my oldest living general is the next one in line. Her name is Gail Reels. And Gail Reels will make sure you know she was the first that was competitively promoted because the first one was appointed. So Gail's still alive. We've developed a great relationship. She was hesitant to tell her story. But anyway, long story short, did I kind of answer? I didn't answer your question at all, but I kind of gave you some background on why I really don't care, right? I hate to say that, but I'm proud of these 10 women, now 11. But there's structural reasons why, and there's missions reasons why. We don't do anything to transport people like the Air Force does. The Air Force has a lot of helpful Navy. We don't, so the Navy is our chaplaincy and our medical corps. Marine Corps is so devoted to combat that we don't even raise those people in our service. We borrow them from the Navy. So that's how mission focused we are, and that's why we have very few. What? Oh, I'm sorry. So let's talk about my women generals. I call them mine. I think they call me their researcher. So anyway, these are the 10 that existed during my study. I've got another. I just put the next slide in. So they range from Margaret Brewer, and I'll go through briefly, very, very briefly. Margaret Brewer deceased in 2013. She was the first appointed in 1978. She stayed for 2 years and retired in 1980. General Reels is my oldest living. She was 1-star. She was promoted in 1985 and retired in 90. General Mutter is still very active. She is the first 3-star general. General Mutter is the first 3-star to have been, here's another DOD interesting story. She was the first one selected, the Marine Corps. We knuckle dragged for our first one, and then we said, screw it, we're gonna lead the way, and we're gonna select our first 3-star. Marine Corps selected her, but the Navy selected and promoted faster than the Marine Corps could get a position for her to promote her to 3-star. So the Navy has the first promoted 3-star. We have the first in the DOD, in the country, ever in the history of the military. She's still alive. She's doing great. She lives in Indiana. General Wilson lives in Virginia, and she is the only other 3-star. So these are our 2 3-star generals, both retired, and General Wilson declined to participate in my study. Of interest, she is the only other doctoral educated person in here. She has an EDD from the University of Southern California. General Cruza Dawson lives in Florida. She was a military policewoman. And ironically enough, kind of an interesting story, she met me in Virginia, although she lives in Florida. She gave me 2 hours. That's all I asked. That's all she gave me. But she gave me 9 names of people that I could go talk to about her. So I think that's, for those psychologists and mental kinds of people, I think that's interesting that she offered me to go talk to people about her and only offered me 2 hours of direct communication. I think that's interesting. General Salinas, for those of you that have seen the NPR, General Salinas was interviewed in Women of War. She is now San Antonio, Texas, involved with Girl Scouts. She retired as a 2-star in 2013, and she is the first and only woman Hispanic general in the Marine Corps, female general. General Garrett was my gatekeeper. She lives in Washington State. She is the first reserve general. She got out after having her first child. There's an interesting story in my dissertation about her. It was because of having children and becoming a mother that caused her to leave. She was at Camp Pendleton. Her work hours required her to work and exceed the hours of daycare, and she couldn't see a way. So she went back to where her home state is. She lives in Port Townsend, Washington, near Seattle. She went to University of Washington. Of note, she was also one of the first to receive a 4-year ROTC Marine Option Scholarship in 1972. General Monahan, very interesting. She was married to an active duty Marine. He retired at the rank of lieutenant colonel. He was an infantry officer. They live up in New Jersey. She works for Amazon right now in their operations department. She retired as a 1-star, and she has 9 children, all birth children. She did it also as a reserve. And she was a logistics officer, I believe, Motor T Logistics. General Reynolds, she is a 2-star. She is on active duty now. She was the first United States Naval Academy graduate to make general in the Marine Corps, as a woman to make general. So she's Naval Academy. She is also a communications officer. So she is in charge of MAR4 Cyber, so our cyber security command. She's a friend of mine. We were friends when we were both majors. She's a year ahead of me. General Helen Pratt, our 3rd woman reserve general. She is single, has always been, lives in Orlando, was the commanding general of the Marine Corps University up until a year ago, and now she is in command of Marine forces in reserve forces in New Orleans. Ooh. Oh, hold on. I skipped a lot. Okay. So now, this is our most recent. She was promoted in July. Actually, I think she was frocked. Frocked means when you have to wear the rank, but you don't get paid for it yet. That's a bureaucratic thing. She will get paid for it eventually. No room, but she has a job that requires her to be a brigadier general. Bobby Shea, prior enlisted, was a Motor T officer, motor transport officer, and then went to the Naval Academy. She got an appointment to the Naval Academy and graduated. So our 2nd Naval Academy graduate. So what factors were examined? I did examine personal issues, personal ideas. So what were the catalysts for their joining the Marine Corps? Some was for money. Some was for giving back. 2 were for education. Run the gambit. From poor means, from rich means. First generation, General Salinas was first generation school, and she enlisted because she was running out of money and thought she was going to drop out because she was partying too hard. Those stories exist, actually. I'm not telling anything out of school. Personal traits, introverts, extroverts. I listen, I talk. I get in their face. I didn't fight that battle. I, didn't confront everybody. I confronted everybody. Run the gambit. No particular style. Leadership strategies, the same way. I listened. I was a servant leader. I was very collaborative. We didn't talk a lot about leadership strategy because I wanted to know how they navigated, if leadership strategy was important to them, because the way I started my interviews were, tell me about your career and how you navigated the Marine Corps. Tell me about your challenges and tell me about what supported your effort. I let them come up with what was priority. I did not drive them. This is part of the methodology. I didn't want to drive them to tell me about things that were not forefront in their mind. I wanted them to pick that out. So it was organic. So sometimes I had to go back and ask what I would have thought were obvious questions because they just never did it. And we'll get to that in a second. Work-life balance. Had some that were married, like General Garrett was married to a seaport captain up in Washington State. He wasn't around to help her. She needed daycare for her kids down at Camp Pendleton. They ended up divorcing. She said the reserves was the best thing that ever happened. She moved back to family. Family helped her take care of her kids. She said she had a job right there, so travel could be minimal. But then I have General Salinas. She never married, but her biggest support was bringing her mom and her sister to come live with her. And they became, it takes a village to be a general officer. They became her village. They were eyes and ears and helpful hands. Everybody in her command, from captain all the way up to 2-star, knew her mother and sister. So a variety, and some married Marines, some married General Mutter, the 3-star, married another Marine, and he put his career on the back burner to support her. Some of these stories are in my dissertation. I'm happy. They're short case studies. I have chapter 4, short case studies, about 13 pages each. I could have gone 25 pages for each. I've got the data. That's for a book eventually. So anyway, the stories are in the dissertation. Gender bias. Some said, and here again, gender bias is relative to the structures and opportunities that these women were afforded and expected to deliver. So because it's been a gradual increase in opportunity, some of these women that came in 1952 had very little physical fitness demand. That wasn't an issue. They were mostly secretaries and administrators and desk jockeys, and it's just since gradual, starting probably when I came in 1982, 87, I came in 87, but ROTC in 83, gradual increase. So gender bias really does increase when physical equality starts to be demanded. And so if you're not pulling your weight, some of the gender bias was more prevalent for my later generals, and they all handled it very differently. Some confronted and some avoided. Physical fitness. Actually, General Salinas will tell you that she was injured very early in her career. And so no pain, no gain was one of her philosophies, and don't show weakness. So I use that as a point of culture because she stuffed it for so long and hid it for so long and nearly broke herself that when the commandant came to her and said, I want you to go be the commanding general of the recruit of the boot camp at Parris Island, South Carolina, she said, sir, I can't do that. I can't physically lead from the front. I am broken. My back hurts. And he goes, so who have you told? And she said, no one. And he said, and he got her an appointment at Bethesda right away, went into surgery the next week, and took command 3 months later. So the culture of hiding, not wanting to be sick bay commando, do you guys know that concept where you're always going to the doctor to get help? That was something that drove her and actually was going to terminate her career without a sponsor like the commandant at the time, who I think was General Krulak. So anyway, she had a sponsor, and he saw that he needed her in that job. She had been at the boot camp at Parris Island before. It was really important, and she took the job and succeeded. Organizational, professional opportunities, education, professional opportunities, meaning I've got a job to work outside of my trained MOS. It gave them visibility. So going lateral, doing lateral jobs and getting greater visibility and greater skill set is very important. And many of them, General Mutter, the 3-star, 7 different military occupational specialties. 7. Everybody knew her. As a matter of fact, because she needed orders to Colorado Springs, Colorado, because her husband had an ailing son, and that was the closest Marine billet that they could get to where he was living, wherever he was sick. The husband needed to get to Colorado Springs. There was not another opportunity for another Marine colonel, because they were both colonels at the time. She had a network of people because of her many jobs that she was in, because of school opportunities at the Naval War College. She tapped that network. She got a job in Colorado Springs and became the first woman space director on the floor in Colorado Springs. She started out as an IT person, computers, doing silly Marine Corps computer things, not space things. Marine Corps doesn't do space. We fly planes, but we don't do space. That's the core competency of the Air Force. She became the first woman to direct and become qualified in all those things in Colorado Springs. So professional relationships. Let's go back to General Mutter. She's not the only one, but because you have school contacts and joint environments, it's very handy to keep professional contacts. The network can't be more important. So What did they have in common? The literature about women succeeding anywhere, and the most recent one was a report done by the women in the CIA. And their finding was these women need to have long-term career strategies. Well, my women actually would say, I did none of this deliberately. It was all accidental. And let's go back to the structure. The structure of the military, for those of you who are not familiar, we move every 3 years. We get orders. We go on to the next job. Sometimes, in the Marine Corps particularly, sometimes we do different jobs. We go from what we call an A billet, which is what we're trained to do, to a B billet, which is something we're not trained to do. So if the duty station was exciting, and if the job looked like it might be promising, the women stayed another tour. To a T, every one of them said, I had no plan. Let's go back to structure and law. Many of them, like the first 4, could not have a structure or a plan or a long-term strategy to be a general because it was impossible. It wasn't even legally available to them. So they said, I said, so when did you decide you were going to be a general? Or when did you decide you were going to, rise to the top? I just found myself laughing. This is their words. I found myself laughing when I was being promoted to general and go, how did I do this? There was no strategy. These women didn't have a long-term strategy. As a matter of fact, I said to my advisor, I said, they didn't have a strategy. And she said, oh, you can't say that. I said, okay, a short-term strategy. She goes, okay, I'll let you get away with that. But anyway, it's in contradiction to a lot of the leadership theory and knowledge and writing that you'll see about women need to have a long-term strategy. How do women have a long-term strategy, really? And I'm single, so to self-disclose, never been married, no children, heterosexual. But I've made that choice. That was a choice that I did to not marry and have children. But women do have decisions to make, and they are uniquely qualified to make that decision to have babies. So you can stay in and do it. I have many a friend that did, and then I have many friends that say, hey, I just want to go off and be a mom. So, but we have those decisions, and sometimes we're inspired at different stages in our ages. So to have a long-term career goal as a woman, I think a man wrote that rule. Have a long-term career strategy. We have so many more personal decisions that we have to make. What is it like? And culture impacts that. Do I want to be the breadwinner? Those things are just now changing. Is the woman the breadwinner and the man stay at home? Does the man want to take care of the kids and the woman go out and make the money? I mean, those decisions are new, and they are socializable, and they are culturally impactful. But women do biologically have different choices to make, and so to have a long-term strategy is to potentially eliminate some of your biological choices. Identity as a Marine. So, the question that I had to go and ask every one of these women at the end of these conversations was, what was it like to be a woman Marine? And they told me to a T. I was a Marine. So the takeaway here for all of us is that your identity is important. You've got individual identity, you have relational identity, you have group or collective identity. I'm telling you, these women right here wanted nothing more than to wear the few, the proud. And when you're a woman Marine, you are really few and very proud. But they just wanted to be a Marine. They said to be anything else was going to make me different. And to be a Marine, to its core, let's get down to the culture. And there's been some work done on culture. We've got women in the room that have talked about this. So culture is important. The fact that I'm talking about the Marine Corps birthday, Air Force, Navy, and Army on a regular basis do not typically, only with friends on Facebook do I hear about this. I mean, this is better than the 6th of January, which is my birthday. I I love this birthday. The reason, short story, reason why I wanted to join started with culture. When I was a little girl, my dad retired when I was 10. If you did the math, you might have figured that out with the two pictures. My dad retired when I was 10 from Parris Island, South Carolina. He was a bigwig. He was a colonel, worked for General Barrow. So those of you that know generals, I was a little girl running around a base. My dad was the third in command on the base, and General Barrow, who ended up being a commandant, one of our best, General Barrow, gentleman through and through, was my dad's commanding general. So my first 10 years, all I knew was in November, my mom and dad would get me a babysitter, and they would go off to this place and bring me back for breakfast the next morning, the corner piece with roses on some cool cake. And I said, where do I get that? And they said, the Marine Corps birthday. And I was like, how do I celebrate that every year? And Dad said, you could become one. And so, long story short, it's funny, but the cake is very important to me. Part of our culture. You know, these women, to get back to it, and you can read the quotes, but these women, many of them knew nothing about the Marine Corps, only 2 or 3. In the back of my dissertation, there is a Women Generals at a Glance sheet. It'll be very interesting for you guys to see that, but some of them had fathers that were Marines, and some of them had fathers in other services, but they were, out of the 10, I'd say 3 women had generals who had fathers that were Marines. When they went to boot camp or officer candidate school, they were only doing it primarily because when you went to officer candidate school, you could go back in the day, and you might still be able to do it now, you can go and get paid for going through the 10 weeks of training and not commit. You don't have to commit to be a Marine. So many of these women did it for summer money, and they did it to challenge themselves. And they said, and boot camp too. One of them, General Salinas, went to boot camp, and she said, I just needed money so I could go back to school the next semester. And she said, and all these women who had no experience said, once you've been through that experience, it is life-changing. They were like quoting all the cool quotes and wearing all the cool T-shirts, and they're like, man, they do a wonderful job of inculcating the culture in such a short period of time. It was so impactful. So these women said, well, why not? So even though they had a choice and they just did it for money, they came back and said, I'll at least give it 4 years, which goes back to the short-term career path. They didn't say, I'm going to come in forever. I didn't either. They said, oh, so you're going to be a lifer? I don't know. I'm going to do it until I stop liking it. And so I have an interesting career path. I didn't like it at the 12-and-a-half-year mark. I got out, and then they recalled me after 9/11. And then I stayed in for the next 9 years. So I have an active duty retirement, but I have broken time because I didn't like it the whole time. I hated it at the 12-and-a-half-year mark. There was one individual Marine that I thought was a terrible leader. And I said, if they promote that to colonel, I better get out while the joke's still on me and not, being court-martialed or otherwise disciplined for being sassy or rude or insubordinate. So I left on my own. But so the culture kept me, and when I got recalled, it was the best part of my career because then we're fighting wars. Unfortunately, as crazy as that sounds, when you're doing exercises in the Marine Corps, it just is a job. But when you're doing something that's life or death, now you got meaning. Now my people who work for me, I want to see come home. So now there is no joke. So that's what happened. The difference was I left a period of exercise to a period of life-changing. But I was always a proud Marine. I just hated that one man that I didn't want to be like. And I thought, shoot, if the Marine Corps promotes him, that's disappointing. So, final conclusion is, there is no recipe. These women are very different. Their stories are fascinating. Some of them had supportive husbands. Some of them had, but they all said, whatever your closest relationship is, needs to be supportive. So General Salinas, her mother and sister were her supporters. They needed her, but she found they needed them, or she needed them. She needed that support that most aspiring and accelerating in rank people need, because the demands socially and professionally grow. And she was able to use non-traditional family members. But then General Mutters will tell you, she was married to a Marine, she divorced him and married this husband now, who she's been with for a long, long time. He put his career on hold so that she could make general, because he knew that his career path was never made generals, male or female. And he said, she has a greater chance of being a general than I do. So, husbands, spouses, family. Structure continues to change. Culture is enduring 242 years. You're never going to talk to a Marine, and then they're really not a Marine if they can't tell you. At least when the Marine Corps birthday is, they say "Oorah," they say "Semper Fidelis," and they know how many years old we are. Anybody know how many years old we are today? 242. 242 years. So, structure is changing, culture never changed, and personal agency, you can be who you are. I am very outspoken. I go face to face with my Marines, and so did many of my women generals. So these are my women generals. I need to make this slide so I can put one more on it. And this is the spreadsheet, the Marines at a glance, that I was going to tell you about. Kind of gives you the dates they served, the degrees they held, whether they were active duty and reserve, married or single, who their spouse was, if they were in the military, what they were, how many children they had, occupational specialty, years of general. So this is a very handy thing if you want to know the transactional aspects of my women generals. But I am proud to speak of them. I hope to add Brigadier General Bobby Shea to my research. And I think that's all I have right now. So, oorah, happy birthday, 242, and I open it up for questions. Thanks. Thank you. Thanks. Yes? So the very interesting part, so the methodology part that I discovered was, no, it didn't change me, but I was self in research. And it was, for those of you that are doing or thinking about doing dissertations, very hard. I had to do a preface to make sure that everybody knew why I was interested in the study, and to kind of help separate myself out, because I had some preconceived ideas that everybody had a male role model that was a Marine, and that they all played sports. I like team sports. I think team sports made me a better leader in the Marine Corps, because you start to appreciate positions on a team. And so I thought, wouldn't it be funny if all the women generals were sports and had fathers, or a male role model in their life that was Marine? So that wasn't true. The biggest impact that I would say it had on me, my research, was identity. So I didn't do an initial lit review on identity. When those women, I had to go back and ask what it was like for them to be women generals. And they said, no, I just felt like I belonged. I didn't need to be a woman. I wanted to belong. So to belong is to take the collective identity. Well, I said, well, where did I get that from? Well, the issue is that when you're born at Quantico, which I was born on a Marine base. My dad knew lots of cool generals. General Gray used to work for my dad. General Gray is legendary in the Marine Corps. My dad used to work for Chesty Puller during Korea War. He was on the Incheon Landing, first Marine Division when Chesty Puller was a colonel. You know, and at some point I had this realization during my research. I was like, who's going to tell me I don't belong? Seriously? And I didn't have that recognition. You know, I knew it was cool that I was born in Quantico, and I knew that was cool that my dad was cool. General Gray would come up, oh, you're Waldrop. And I still have people coming up and saying, oh, your dad was the CO of RTR at Parris Island when I went through boot camp. And so, but I was born at Quantico. I grew up with a piece of birthday cake in my mouth, you know. Probably a silver spoon too, because my mom did, back in the day, they really entertained. So silver and china and all that stuff. I was serving drinks to General Barrow as a 10-year-old in my parents' parties. So at some point, the identity of being a Marine, I mean, that's a huge advantage for me. So for a man to come up and say, you don't belong in my Marine Corps, I never knew that until like the last 3 years. But in the Marine Corps, I never let them bully me like that. You know, I always had some smart comeback. The joke, actually, do you all remember 1992 when Tailhook was going on? Probably not. So Tailhook was it's a big Navy aviation convention that's held in Las Vegas. Huge disaster socially. Women were starting to come up in the ranks of aviation in the Navy. And there was a debacle. It just went socially bad. Sexual harassment, bad games being played on the floors of hotel rooms. It was just awful. So anyway, they scrutinized everybody's selection for promotion in 1992, and I was up for captain. So and I got promoted to captain in November 1992. So my promotion was in jeopardy. The issue was, so my dad was a retired Marine colonel, played golf at Camp Lejeune, because that's where he retired out in North Carolina. And long story short, he played golf with all these old guys, and they said, so how's Marianne handling the sexual harassment that's going on in the service right now? How's she handling that? And Dad said, well, she hasn't been brought up on any charges yet. So I didn't know that I had that reputation with my father, but he obviously knew me pretty well. And long story short, my dad never encouraged me to go in the Marine Corps. He said, go Navy, because he only knew, he retired in 75. He only knew women to be secretaries in the Marine Corps. And he wanted me, as an infantry officer, he suffered from this. He wanted me to have a marketable skill. So he said, go Navy. He said, Navy's got a lot more opportunities for you. And I said, and by 1985, I was reading all these articles in the Marine Corps Gazette, which is one of our professional periodicals, and they were talking about all the opportunities that were emerging for women in the Marine Corps. And I said, no, Dad, see, I can do all this stuff. And so I became a Marine, and he commissioned me, and he was very proud of me. But he never, and when I became a math major at University of North Carolina, never told me that math was for boys. I just said, Dad, I hate to read. I said, I'm pretty good at this math thing, and it's got a great process. You know, you do this, and then you do this, and then you do this, and there's always a right answer. And so he goes, go for it. Well, I never knew. So even in college, I never knew that I was like the only girl in class. So it's really where you focus and where you pay attention. And I never looked for being different. I always looked for being one of everybody in the class. Oh, we all have a math interest. Cool. Right? And we all like to be a Marine. Cool. So, any other questions? Yes. Mm-hmm. Yep. Right. Yes. Yes. Actually, this is a long story. I talk about it a lot. I'll try to put it in 2 sentences. Actually, I think that these opportunities that are being afforded, this expansion of opportunities being afforded to women, is going to be counterproductive to the end result. And I say that because it's a tough life. So my analogy is, you can run a marathon. Many of us do. We're not professional marathoners. We're in school. We're faculty. So I train for a marathon. I train for it. I see it a year from now. These women are training for these programs. They're training for Ranger School. They're training for infantry officers course. It's their sole focus to get through and to graduate. The difference is, and many of us get that marathon, they get the certificate, and then we get to take a break. You forget that you carbo loaded the night before. You changed your life to do this 1 year of training for the marathon for most of us. They changed their life to go and do this Ranger School and this infantry officers course. Very few. We've just graduated our first woman at the end of September, first woman in the infantry in the Marine Corps. Okay, that's one. One, so I've got a lot of friends that are 24 years plus. One, there's not a lot of people that want to do this. And two, it takes a toll on the female physiology. So I'm telling you, they think this is the panacea for promotion to general and to be competitive amongst their peers. I'd say it's a panacea for medical retirement. I say that the female physiology is not going to see them lasting to be competitive through their careers for 32 years. It barely can happen for a male physiology. For the male, and not to mention some of these women want to go have maybe babies. And oh, by the way, you're not always an infantry officer. You go off and do your B billet. You go off and do a desk job. You still have to run that marathon every stinking day. And I'm drawing the analogy you see here. I hope that I haven't lost the analogy. They're running the marathon every stinking day. So when you take a sabbatical, like the Navy and the Marine Corps are starting to offer women, I think, where you get to go off and do your own thing, get to go off and have babies, and then you come back in. They'll take you back in at some maybe commensurate rank, and then you come back in and finish your career. If they do that as infantry, I'm telling you, if I take a week off, and this was when I was 40, if I take a week off as a woman, and I was a hard charger, baby. I was making a first class on the male PFT when I was a youngster. So I was hungry, and I'd done it. But I'm telling you, as you get older, I shouldn't be telling anybody any kind of story here. For women, it's harder to come back, and if you don't maintain it every stinking day, if you take a week off, holy crap. If you take 3 years off for a B billet and then try to come back in and do what is required for infantry, if you haven't broken yourself by now, you may break yourself. So I and a few of my friends who are retired Marine colonels, female, think that this might be very counterproductive to the end result, which is to see women through and to be competitive in a combat arms job when I suspect that it may shorten careers, not lengthen them. Thanks. I love talking, oh, my honor, thanks, thank you. I love talking about that. I will talk about that at length, and I love to have people shoot holes in my story. I'm passionate about what this new opportunity may not lead to. And I want the best for women, but I'm telling you, they didn't create the intel job. I was an intel officer. They didn't create the intel job for me because I was a woman. They needed me, and I could do my job. And I didn't need to be competitive with my, for general. I was very viable and feel very proud of my service. Thanks. Thank you. Thanks.